Hello everyone. So I'm Nirmalan Wigneswaran. It's a tongue twister. It's a good thing you all didn't have to hear my full name, which is Nirmala Guhan Wigneswaran, which means the blemishless one who dwells in the cave of your heart. That's just my first name. So so my presentation is going to be very different from what you have heard all this while. So I'm the one who is trying to make the ocean boil. So we are the ones from the anecdote that was mentioned earlier. So we are trying to implement things. And what I thought I would share with you is some of the problems that we have faced, some of the challenges that we have had, and some of the things that we are trying. Some of the matters that Lubika just talked about are issues that we are facing right now. We've been having meetings with professional associations, and we've been looking at those issues. Before I start, perhaps I should have a caveat, a disclaimer that these views are just mine, since I work for the government, and it does not represent that of the Attorney General's Department of Sri Lanka or the government of Sri Lanka. I find that stating that upfront is always great because it implies that I'm going to say something extremely controversial and anti-government. But it's going to be quite perfunctory, I'm afraid. So what I'm trying to connect is our theme of who gets to be part of us, migration, and Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan context. So I'm going to address three issues because I'm told that lawyers in the US apparently have a maximum of 3 clients. That seems to be the current thing. So I thought I would stick to that and have 3 issues that I would deal with. First, I will be looking at the question of us or them, defining who is us and who is them, and the problem with the Indian Tamils, so to speak, in Sri Lanka. Then I will talk about the Tamil diaspora and how to get them back to us. So there's a distinction for those who don't know about Sri Lanka. I'll just give a brief history of Sri Lanka in, say, 1 minute, if that's possible. We've been doing 1 billion years in 3 minutes, so I think 2,500 years in 1 minute is possible. One of there are several communities in Sri Lanka. The majority community is the Sinhalese. Then you get the Tamils, who are known as Sri Lankan Tamils, and then you also have Indian Tamils, whom I would speak about in a moment. So the first issue is about the Indian Tamils, the second about the Tamil diaspora who left the country, and the third is what we were just talking about earlier, about employment visas and immigration reform, and how do they visit us, under what conditions can they, the outsiders, visit us. So Sri Lanka is actually a story of migration from its founding myth, which I cannot repeat because it's in polite company, because it deals with bestiality, incest, and treachery. So that's our founding myth. Teaching that to children who are 7 years and 8 years old. But it's a story of, more importantly, it's a story of migration. It's a story of a migrant prince. The founding myth is about a migrant prince coming to Sri Lanka and starting off things in Sri Lanka. We have the world's longest unbroken historical account from 500 BC, which is all about South Indian invasions, migrations, and its effect on Sri Lanka. It's a written record of migration. Colonial rule is migration in a form. So we had the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. Now I will just talk about one historical event which I think is a segue to my first issue. And that was the peasant revolt of 1848. And why is that important? Because after the British captured the entire country in 1815, the nobility revolted. They were put down brutally. And then in 1848, there was a peasant revolution where the people actually revolted. It was the Matale revolution, rebellion. And one of the reasons for that was the fact that the British brought in several 100,000 workers from India to work in the middle part of Sri Lanka, in the hill country, in the newly started coffee plantations. And that meant that the people of the area didn't have opportunity to do their work. They refused to do that work, and that's why these people were brought in. But it still meant there was a lot of resentment, and that with additional taxes started this peasant revolt. And the question of us or them, or Indian Tamils, are these group of Tamils who were brought from India 100 years earlier, and just at the time of independence, you had all of them were called British subjects. We didn't have citizens, so we had no us or them other than a British subject. So we had independence in 1948, and the very year that we had independence, we brought in the Ceylon Citizenship Act. So exactly 100 years later. And that Ceylon Citizenship Act, and then subsequently the Indian and Pakistani Citizenship Act, what it did was it virtually rendered stateless all these Indian Tamils, who at that point numbered about 800,000 or 900,000. So all of them became stateless. The Indian and Pakistani Citizenship Act had some kind of mechanism, but there was flawed implementation. In November 1964, 20 years later, only 140,000 out of 824,000 people at the time had become citizens. And then you had India getting involved, an external force coming in to try to force a settlement. And you had the Srima Shastri Pact in 1964. So here was a situation where you had a question of these these people who were once all British citizens, and now they were the others. And this was termed a numbers game. This Srima Shastri Pact of 1964 and the implementing legislation was considered a numbers game, and it could not be implemented for another 20 years because of the question of whether it's 4:7 or 4:7. What does that mean? Does it mean it was the idea was for every 4 Indian Tamils who Sri Lanka would take, India would take 7. But the dispute was it that they would be repatriated to India, or would they be granted Indian citizenship? That issue took another 20 years to be resolved. So meanwhile, these people were stateless, and they had the most horrific living conditions. In 1986, there was a further act, so we're looking at over 40 years now, and there were still 469,000 people who were still without a state. Finally, you had the 1988 Special Provisions Act, which, as has been described, on the cusp of local parliamentary elections and presidential elections, brought about a solution for a lot of these people. That was not a final solution. That was the reason for that was at that time, India was militarily involved in Sri Lanka. It had already brought in the Indian peacekeeping force in relation to the civil war Sri Lanka was having with the Tamil Tigers, and no one wanted to give the Indians another excuse to bring in additional force. So that was one of the reasons people feel that this act came in 1988 and was passed. So there were still 84,000 people. The issue continued until 2009 to finally resolve this issue. And why? Why was this? One of the reasons was the Kandyan Sinhalese people in the middle of the country would have become the minority if all those persons had become Sri Lankan citizens at the time of independence. That would have created a huge imbalance. So that was a great fear at the time. In the 1947 elections just before this, before independence, almost all the Indian Tamils voted for the left-leaning parties, and the government at the time did not have left-leaning views. So they felt that the best thing to do was to disenfranchise these people. So these were the ideas, the short-term political gain which trumped over basic dignity and rights. Or if you are looking at it in today's context, are we to frame this as they were just not us enough. So how does one look at it? Is it something that has to be, was it a political manipulation, or was it just a conception of they versus us? Now the second issue is the diaspora and of the Sri Lankans who left Sri Lanka during the war. There was a migration following Black July. There were previous riots in the 50s, but in 1980 there was a massive exodus. So the Tamil diaspora, you have about 900,000 of them. They have around the world. They have economic and political. They are both economic and political migrants. They are politically very active, largely successful. They were funding the Tamil Tigers, and there were also about 100,000 of these 900,000 people in refugee camps in India. The dramatic decimation of the Tamil Tigers and the end of the civil war in 2009 had the diaspora at odds with the war-winning government. Immediately after that, as a policy mechanism, because of the national security concept prevailing at the time, the government prevented dual citizenship applications being processed. So that meant a lot of this diaspora couldn't come back into Sri Lanka. So there were two solutions that have taken place. I'll just rush through them. One is getting the refugees back. In a recent National Human Rights Action Plan, what we did was we linked the refugees with IDPs, internally displaced persons, and this issue was addressed for the first time, and people have started returning in 2017. The next issue is trying to get this diaspora back as partners, not as the refugees, but as partners. That has been changed after the new government came into power in 2015. From 1987 to 2011, you had 42,000 applications. In the 10 months since 2015, you had 14,000 applications. So there's a lot of interest, and this issue is now being used by the government to get the diaspora back into the fold, so to speak. There is still a problem with the perception of the Tamil diaspora in the Sinhalese media. There is research on this. And the question is, can these people come back and invest? One of the issues that we know currently is to get them to invest directly in the northern and eastern provinces where Tamils, where there are majority Tamils. There's a Chief Minister's Fund initiative which has been stalled due to issues with approvals, but these are other issues that are currently mechanisms to harness the potential of the diaspora. Now we'll come to the last issue, which is actually a question of there being a legal lacuna and a lack of trust. Right now, our immigration laws are extremely ad hoc as to who could bring in a person to work in Sri Lanka. All you need to do is to get your relevant line minister's approval, and then you can bring that person into work. I know you said that the spouses can't work, but you can do that with just getting an approval. It's just that it's not transparent, and it's just completely ad hoc. We had a trade agreement which was completely negotiated, but it was not signed, called the CEPA, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between Sri Lanka and India, and that collapsed in 2018 on the issue of getting Indian workers coming into Sri Lanka. So we can talk about how important it is to get foreign workers in and how they can be utilized and how it's good for our economy. But the political reality is that it is impossible to do that unless you can sell the idea to the people. And one of the groups which have been extremely vociferous has been the unions, the professional associations that you spoke about, and I have had the misfortune of having to sit with them and negotiate with them. And it has been extremely difficult for the reason that they are a very vociferous group who have a lot of visibility, and given the current context of the government being a coalition government, this is a very sensitive matter. So we have to cut some corners, we have to make some compromises, and so you have the economic costs and the political costs. So they don't really frame their issue as getting outside people coming into Sri Lanka and taking our jobs. They say we are doing this to prevent the employment of unqualified persons. That's how the unions say it. But you know, that's how they would say it, right? So these are some of the strategies that we have been employing with them. We've been engaging with the unions. We have said that we need a comprehensive reform of our immigration laws. As a short-term measure, what we're trying to do is we're trying to have a regulation as a stopgap measure which gives some kind of satisfaction to these unions that a person's qualifications would be vetted. There would be certain formal qualification recognition, and that there would be a National Human Resources Council which will be empowered to look into this, and that there would be minimum pays, structures, local advertisements, and prior to hiring from outside for certain areas. And at the same time, we are trying to smooth the process so that investors can come in very quickly and work out the paperwork and prove all of these things thereafter. So it's like a come now, prove all these qualification issues later. So that way we are trying to arrive at a balance between efficiency so that the investors can come in straight away, and all these requirements can be fulfilled at a later stage. So that's somewhat the balance that we are trying to achieve. So those are the strategies, and I would be happy to discuss over at the question time. Maybe we could see what you think is advisable of these. Thank you.